So for the outline, I'm going to split this into two sessions. A basic concept and fundamental, which will build on to the more complex evaluation designs in epidemiology. In between this, there will be some question and answers and possibly a 1-minute break. My assumption here is everybody in the audience has a different level of understanding of epidemiology, and I will aim to carry everyone along. In every field, there are notable personalities. One of such in the field of epidemiology is Sir Austin Bradford Hill. Sir Hill was an epidemiologist and an English epidemiologist and a statistician. What he's famous for is pioneering the randomized clinical trial. Together with a second epidemiologist, Richard Doll, he demonstrated the connection between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. What Hill is widely known for are his causal criteria, and I'll show you this in a minute. So the first concept we'll be touching on is the criteria for causation. Now, over 50 years ago, Hill proposed 9 causal criteria. Let me give you a background. In epidemiology, we'll talk about an exposure and an outcome. An exposure leads to an outcome. Now, an exposure might be associated with an outcome, meaning it changes with the outcome. An exposure could also be causal to an outcome, meaning it causes the outcome. Hill had 9 criteria. I'll discuss this in detail, but I'll flash this in the current slide. One of this was strength of association, consistency, specificity, temporality, biologic gradient, experiment, plausibility, coherence, and analogy. Let's go through each of these in a bit detail. As regards criteria for causation, one of the criteria Hill spoke about was strength of association, meaning the stronger an association was, the greater the likelihood for causation. Let's look at an example. Assuming we had researchers who were conducting a study to determine risk factors for high blood pressure. Assuming these researchers demonstrated that cigarette smoking had a relative risk of 10 to cause with hypertension as the outcome. What this means is those who smoked cigarettes had 10 times increase in risk when compared to those who did not smoke. In this same study, if consumption of beef, for example, had a relative risk of 1.5, what Hill's criteria was saying was cigarette smoking was more likely a causal factor than beef. The second one is consistency, where Hill spoke about associations that were repeated consistently had a greater likelihood of causation. So associations repeated in different people, different geographies, across different times, and with different methods. Hill spoke about specificity, where an observed association, if it was specific to an outcome, it was more likely causal. Now, what that presupposed was a single exposure would lead to a single disorder. This has frequently been criticized because in reality, what you have is multifactorial risk factors. Let's take, for example, hypertension. Hypertension is associated with increased salt intake in diets. It's associated with sedentary lifestyle, obesity, and smoking. Hill spoke about temporality. Now, this is a compulsory criteria for causation. What it means is the risk factor should always precede the outcome. In this case, smoking will precede lung cancer to be causal and not vice versa, which is unlikely. Hill described biologic gradient, so-called graded dose response, where an outcome, the likelihood of an outcome increases with increasing dosage of the risk factor. So this is a more linear Hill criteria. For example, the more an individual smokes, the higher the risk for lung cancer. In reality, however, you can have some risk factors act this way, where risk factors have to get to a certain threshold before they have an effect on the outcome. An example of this is paracetamol overdose, where you have to ingest a certain gram per kilogram to be at risk of liver damage. Risk factors could also act this way, where they plateau. An example of risk factors that might do this are those that interact through receptors. And what we know about receptors is you get to a point where receptors get saturated and you might not see the effect. Hill spoke about experiments where causation was more likely if a finding arises from a randomized experiment. He also spoke about plausibility, where if you had the presence of a biological explanation, a risk factor was more likely causal. Let's look at vaccines in modern day. You do an efficacy trial for a vaccine and you demonstrate immunogenicity in the people you administer the vaccine to. In reality, it's not exactly simple because there's a lot happening. Before the vaccine got to that stage, a lot of trials have been done outside the human body. There have been animal experiments done which have demonstrated how the vaccine affects the human body and how the human body responds to the vaccine. So there's a lot of theory around that, the biological explanation. Hill proposed coherence also. Coherence just states that for a finding to be causal, it should not contradict scientific dogma. An example of this might be maybe a study shows smoking is protective against lung cancer. That is contradicting scientific dogma and will most likely not be causal. He spoke about analogy where a similar effect has previously been shown. If a similar effect has previously been shown, causality might be likely. Let's take a new virus. Now, Zika virus did this, where Zika virus caused poor pregnancy outcomes. If you remember, I think 3 or 4 years ago, poor pregnancy outcomes, where you had children of those mothers who had Zika virus coming out with small head sizes and other anomalies. The reason why this is plausible is because we have previous knowledge that there have been viruses like rubella, herpes viruses that have had similar effects in the past. Let's move to the next concept. This is what a simplistic model, exposures will lead to outcomes. In reality, however, this model is more complex. In fact, it's even more complex than this, but for the benefit of the presentation, let's look at this model. If an exposure can directly exact its effects on the outcome, an exposure can act indirectly through a second variable, which is a mediator, to exact its effects. So exposures have direct effects and indirect effects. There's also a confounder. Now, the relationship between exposure and outcome might not be real. And this might be because the exposure is associated with a confounder, which is a true risk factor of the outcome. I'll give you examples of this on the next slide. Let's take, for example, some researchers have documented that excessive alcohol intake leads to lung cancer. Could that be a novel finding, or could it be because of a confounder? Think about it. In this relationship, cigarette smoking is a confounder. Cigarette smoking is a known risk factor for lung cancer. Those who drink excessively are more likely to smoke. You see the confounding relationship. Now let's assume excessive alcohol intake leads directly to lung cancer. It might have direct effects on causing lung cancer, but it might also act indirectly through a second mechanism. For example, let's say alcohol needs to be degraded to a substance, which might also cause lung cancer. Let's look at the second example of confounding. Assuming researchers show women with a higher order of births, so women who give birth to more children, are more likely to have children with Down syndrome. Now, Down syndrome is a congenital anomaly. Is this a new finding? No. It might be affected by the relationship of a known risk factor, maternal age with Down syndrome. Women greater than 35 years have a higher risk of Down syndrome than those lesser than 35 years. And the likelihood that the older a woman, the more likely she will have a higher order of births. So you see the association there. I'm sure you're wondering why I have the movie The Titanic on this page. Well, if you believe me, we're discussing the science of it, and the concept is the counterfactual. If you've never heard of the movie Titanic, it was an epic movie in the late 90s where Leonardo DiCaprio played Jack, and Kate Winslet played Rose. So it's the classic tale of boy meets girl, rich girl, poor boy on a boat, the Titanic, and then they fall in love. Sadly, we're not discussing the romance, we're discussing science. So bear with me. The third concept is the counterfactual. Let's say in an alternate reality, there was no Titanic, there was no boat. If every aspect of their lives were still constant, Kate being the rich girl, or Rose being the rich girl, Jack being the poor boy, and every other aspect, will the outcome, which is their love, still occur? That's the concept of the counterfactual. This alternate reality, the application of it in epidemiology is the concept of the control group. Now, you see, the control group ideally should be similar in every respect to the intervention group, apart from receipts of the intervention. So that's the concept of the counterfactual and alternate reality. The next concept is study designs. One study design is a cross-sectional study where you take one time point, a slice, a snapshot. Cross-sectional studies are prevalence studies. Because of the one snapshot, you are taking exposure and outcome at the same time. An example of this might be, let's say we're trying to study the prevalence of falls in the last week in the over 50s. An advantage of this study is it's inexpensive, it's timely. But remember, we're taking exposure and outcome at the same time. So we can't assess temporality. Which happens first? Is it the exposure? Is it the outcome? We might also miss those symptoms that occur fleetingly. A second study is the longitudinal study. The longitudinal study involves two or more snapshots. Usually what happens is the second snapshot is compared to the baseline, or subsequent snapshots are compared to baseline. For a cohort study, it involves follow-up of a group in time that have a common exposure. There's also qualitative designs which rely on data obtained from the researcher from first-hand observations, interviews, it could be focus groups, participant observations, or ethnography, that's recordings made in natural settings. One common feature compared to the other studies is the other studies test a hypothesis, but the qualitative design creates an understanding from the data as the analysis proceeds. Another study design is the case control. So the case has the disease of the interest. The control doesn't. So we walk back from outcome to exposure. An example of this is very good for rare diseases. An example of this might be we're trying to see the exposures for brain cancer, and we have cases with brain cancer and controls who don't have, and then we examine them for their relative exposures. In the randomized control trial, a group is randomly distributed or randomly allocated to either the intervention group or the control. Another concept is bias. Now, let me paint a situation of or a story. of a trained marksman who goes to the shooting range. He's trained, he goes to the shooting range and he fires 4 shots, but he misses his target. The marksman might think, what could be the problem? Could it be my rifle has a problem? Could it be a problem with my eyesight? That's a real life example of bias. You see, in bias, our methods and study procedures lead us to a systematic deviation from the truth. So we end up drawing incorrect associations or incorrect conclusions. We might find an association in reality where there's none, or might not find one where there is. There are different examples of bias. One of this is selection bias. In selection bias, the researcher picks a non-representative sample. Others include information bias, which might be observer bias, where there's a problem with the methods of detecting the outcome. It could also be recall bias, where in a case control, you're asking about exposures and individuals might not recall the history of their exposures. Now, the goal of every study or every researcher is to minimize bias. You cannot eliminate bias, but you can minimize it through having sound methods and sound designs. So the skill is not in conducting the perfect study, but in recognizing the bias in your study and assessing the likely impacts of its imperfections. Another concept I would like to touch on is validity. Now imagine a concept called the truth or the true effects. Whatever study we do, what we try to do is we try to approximate reality. We try to give our best version of the truth. In internal validity, what it seeks to answer is, do the findings of our study reflect the truth in the population? Another type of validity is external validity. What we do in research is we study one sample and we attempt to ascribe our findings in that sample to the whole population. For example, you might pick a sample to study hypertension in the UK. You can't study the whole population with hypertension in the UK, but you can have a sample. What external validity says is, in your sample, how generalizable are your results to the whole population? Comparing bias and validity, bias is in the doing. Bias will lead to impaired validity. Validity is the takeaway from your study. How is the takeaway and interpretation from your study? How, unquote and unquote, truthful is your study? In reality, however, there's an internal tug of war between internal validity and external validity, and we'll come to this in the next session. Thank you for listening. This is the first session. Happy to answer any questions.